On Thanksgiving, my daughter laughed when she handed me a $2 lottery ticket, and I realized in that moment exactly how little I meant to her. I remember the way the room smelled that evening: roasted turkey, cinnamon, something sweet in the oven, the kind of warmth that used to mean family. But that night it felt staged, like a picture someone else had carefully arranged, and I had simply been placed into it as an afterthought, sitting at the far end of the table where the light didn't quite reach, watching Sophie beam as she opened her gift, a glossy envelope tied with a gold ribbon. Daniel leaning in with that proud smile, and when she pulled out the cruise package brochure, 12 Days in the Mediterranean, her laughter filled the room like it belonged there, like it had roots, like it was expected, and everyone clapped, even me. I clapped softly, because that's what you do when you're trying to keep something from cracking open inside your chest. And then it was my turn. Sophie turned to me with that same smile, but it didn't land the same way. It never did. "We didn't forget you, Mom," she said, and there was something in her tone, light, almost playful, as she slid a small paper ticket across the table toward me. "Just $2, folded once, like a receipt. Just a little something fun," Daniel added, and I nodded, because what else do you do when your worth has been measured and placed neatly in front of you for everyone to see? I picked it up carefully, smoothing the edges with my fingers, feeling how thin it was, how easy it would be to tear. And for a second I wondered if that was the point, if they expected me to laugh, to play along, to be the easy one, the one who never made things uncomfortable. I heard Sophie say something about how I don't need much anyway. And the table chuckled, not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to let it pass as a joke. And I smiled too, because I've learned over the years that silence can say more than any protest ever could. I folded the ticket again and slipped it into my purse, right next to my keys and a pack of gum, and I stayed through dessert, through the polite conversation, through Daniel explaining the cruise itinerary in detail as if I were part of the plan, as if I had somewhere to be in that story. And when I finally stood to leave, Sophie hugged me quickly, already half turned back toward the kitchen. "Drive safe, Mom," she said, "like I always do, like I always will." And the cold air outside felt cleaner than the warmth I had just left behind. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the streetlights stretching long across the windshield, and when I got inside, the house was exactly as I'd left it, quiet, still, everything in its place. I hung my coat, set my purse on the counter, and for a while I just stood there, listening to nothing, because sometimes nothing is louder than anything you could hear in a crowded room. And then, almost without thinking, I reached into my purse and pulled out the ticket. The paper was slightly creased now, a little softer from being handled, and I turned it over in my hand, studying the numbers like they might change if I looked long enough. I wasn't expecting anything. Not really. It was just something to do, something small, something that belonged to me alone. So I walked over to the kitchen drawer where I keep a pen and an old notepad, and I sat down at the table, the same table where I drink my coffee every morning, and I checked the numbers once, slowly, carefully, matching each one with the results on my phone, and then I checked them again, because something about the first time didn't feel real, didn't settle properly, and my hands started to tremble just a little, not from excitement, not yet, but from the feeling that something was shifting beneath me, something I couldn't quite name. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ticket, at those tiny printed numbers that suddenly seemed heavier than they should, and I thought about the way Sophie had laughed, the way Daniel had looked at her, the way the room had felt so certain about who I was. And I realized, sitting there in that quiet kitchen, that sometimes the smallest things are the ones people never bother to take seriously, and sometimes those are the things that change everything. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the ticket resting on my nightstand like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. And every time I closed my eyes I saw the numbers again, lining up too perfectly, too cleanly, as if they had been waiting for me all along. And sometime around 3 in the morning I sat up, reached for my phone, and checked them again, just to be sure I had not imagined it, just to make sure I had not misunderstood something so simple. And when the same result stared back at me, unchanged, undeniable, I felt something settle deep inside my chest. Not excitement, not yet, but a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that does not shout, does not celebrate. It just exists, steady and immovable. And I realized that whatever this was, whatever had just happened, It was not something I needed to share, not immediately, not with them, especially not with them. The sun came up slowly that morning, pale light slipping through the blinds, and I moved through my usual routine as if nothing had changed. I made coffee, measured out the grounds, poured the water, waited for it to brew, the familiar rhythm grounding me, anchoring me in something ordinary while everything else felt anything but. I sat at the table and took a sip, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, and I thought about Sophie, about the way she had said I did not need much, about how easily those words had come to her, as if they had been rehearsed, as if they had always been true in her mind, and I tried to remember when that shift had happened, when I had gone from being someone she relied on to someone she simply accommodated. It had not been sudden, nothing like that ever is. It had been gradual, quiet, almost invisible at first. Missed phone calls that were not returned, holidays that became optional, decisions made without asking me, without even informing me until after they had already happened. And I had adjusted, of course I had, because that is what you do when you love someone. You make space for them, you step back, you tell yourself it is just a phase, just a busy season, just life moving forward. But sitting there with that cup of coffee, with that ticket still folded neatly in my pocket, I could see it more clearly than I ever had before. It was not life moving forward. It was me being moved out of the way, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left to move. I finished my coffee and stood up, rinsed the mug, set it in the rack to dry, and then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I picked up the phone and called the number printed on the back of the ticket. My hand was steady now, surprisingly so, and when the automated voice answered, I followed the instructions carefully, pressing each button, entering each number, confirming each detail. And when a real person finally came on the line, her voice calm and professional, asking me to verify the ticket information, I read it aloud slowly, each digit deliberate, each word measured. And there was a pause on the other end, just a brief one, but long enough for me to notice, long enough for me to understand that something had shifted on her side as well. And when she spoke again, her tone had changed, not dramatically, just enough to carry weight. She told me that I would need to come in person to validate the ticket, that there were procedures, identification requirements, paperwork, all the things that come with something this significant. And I thanked her, wrote down the address she gave me, and ended the call. I stood there for a moment with the phone still in my hand, listening to the silence that followed, and I realized that this quiet, was different from the silence of the night before. This one felt like possibility, like a door that had been closed for so long I had forgotten it was even there. And now it was open, not wide, not yet, but enough to let something through. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street was the same as it had always been. The same houses, the same trees, the same cars parked along the curb. Nothing about the world had changed. And yet everything about my place in it felt different, not because of the money, not really, but because of what it revealed, because of what it allowed me to see without distraction, without doubt. I thought about calling Sophie then, just to hear her voice, just to see if anything in me would respond the way it used to, but I did not. Instead, I reached for my purse, took out the ticket, and placed it carefully back inside, zipping it closed with a small, precise motion, as if sealing something important, something private. I knew that at some point they would find out. News like this does not stay hidden forever, but the timing of that, the way it happened, that was something I could control, something I had not been able to say about my life in a very long time. And as I turned away from the window, as I moved through the house with a steadiness that felt new and unfamiliar, I made a quiet decision, one that did not need to be spoken out loud to be real. I would not rush. I would not react. I would watch. I would listen. And I would let them show me exactly who they were, without interruption, without interference. Because for the first time in a very long time, I finally had the patience to wait and the power to do something about what I found. I did not go to the lottery office that day, or the next. I let the hours pass slowly, deliberately, as if rushing would somehow cheapen what had happened, and instead I focused on the small details of my life that had always been there, but had never felt quite this clear. I watered the plants by the window, trimmed the yellowing leaves, wiped down the kitchen counters even though they were already clean. And all the while I kept noticing how steady my hands were, how calm my breathing felt, as if something inside me had finally stopped bracing for disappointment. and by the second morning I decided it was time. I dressed carefully, not in anything new or expensive, just my usual navy sweater and slacks, the kind of outfit no one ever commented on, and I drove to the address the woman on the phone had given me. The building was larger than I expected, glass doors, clean lines, the kind of place that felt official without needing to say it out loud. And when I stepped inside, the air was cool and quiet, and for a moment I wondered if I looked out of place there, but then I realized that no one was paying attention to me at all, which, in its own way, felt familiar. I approached the front desk and gave my name, and within minutes I was led into a private office where a man in a gray suit greeted me with a polite smile. He introduced himself, asked for the ticket, and I handed it over without hesitation, watching as he examined it closely, his expression professional but focused. And after what felt like a very long minute, he looked up and confirmed what I already knew, that the ticket was valid, that the amount was correct, that the next steps would involve paperwork, verification, options for how the winnings would be distributed, and I listened carefully, asking a few questions, not many, just enough to understand what I needed to know. And when he mentioned the option of remaining anonymous, I felt something tighten slightly in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness. And I asked him to explain that part again, and he did, outlining the legal protections, the processes, the limitations, and as he spoke I could not help but think about Sophie, about Daniel, about the way information moved through our family, quickly when it benefited them, quietly when it did not. And I realized that anonymity was not just a legal option, it was a kind of space, a way to observe without being immediately pulled into their expectations, their assumptions, their sudden interest. And I told him that I would like to proceed that way, at least for now. He nodded, made a note, and continued explaining the rest. And by the time I left that office, with a folder of documents in my hand and a list of appointments to follow up on, I felt something I had not felt in years: control, not over everything, not over the past, but over what came next. I drove home the same way I always did, past the same grocery store, the same gas station, the same row of mailboxes, but everything looked slightly different. Not brighter, not better, just clearer, as if a layer had been removed. And when I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before going inside, thinking about what to do next, thinking about how easy it would be to pick up the phone, to call Sophie, to tell her everything, to hear the surprise in her voice, to feel, even for a moment, like I mattered again in a way that was visible, undeniable. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I knew that kind of reaction would not be about me. It would be about what I had, about what I could provide, about how quickly I could be repositioned in their lives from background to center, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I went inside, set the folder on the kitchen table, and took off my sweater, folding it neatly over the back of a chair. The house was quiet again, just as it had been before, but now the quiet felt intentional, chosen. And later that afternoon my phone rang. Sophie's name on the screen, and for a second I just looked at it, watching it vibrate against the table, remembering how many times I had waited for that name to appear, how many times it had not, and I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice even. "Hello," I said, and she launched into conversation as if no time had passed, as if the distance between us was something imagined. She asked how I was, if I had gotten home safely, if I had enjoyed dinner, and I answered simply, yes, it was nice. And then there was a pause, brief but noticeable, and she mentioned the ticket, lightly, almost as an afterthought. "Did you check it yet?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. And I could picture her smile on the other end of the line, the same one from the night before, and I said, "Not yet," letting the words settle between us, and she laughed softly, said something about how I should not expect much, that those things are just for fun, and I agreed, because in that moment it was easier to agree than to explain, easier to let her believe that nothing had changed. And as the conversation moved on to other things, to her plans, to the cruise, to details I listened to without really hearing, I realized that this was the part that mattered, not the money, not the numbers, but this, the space between what they believed and what was actually true. And I understood that as long as that space existed, I had something they did not: time, perspective, and the ability to decide exactly how and when everything would finally come to light. After I hung up the phone, I placed it face down on the table and sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet settle back into the room, and it struck me how easily Sophie had dismissed the ticket, how quickly she had decided what it meant and what it did not, as if value could be assigned in advance, as if outcomes were something you could predict based on what you believed someone deserved. And I realized that this was not new. This way of thinking, it had been there for years. I just had not been looking at it directly. I had been smoothing it over, explaining it away, telling myself stories that made it easier to accept, and now, with the truth sitting quietly in my purse, those explanations no longer held. They felt thin, almost unnecessary, like something I had outgrown without noticing. I stood up and walked into the living room, my eyes drifting over the photographs on the shelf. Sophie as a little girl in a yellow dress, her hand wrapped tightly around mine, smiling up at the camera with that open, uncomplicated joy that children have. And for a moment I stayed there, looking at that image, trying to connect it to the woman who had laughed across the table just a day before, and I could see the line between them, faint but continuous, shaped by choices, by time, by things said and unsaid. And I wondered when I had stopped being someone she turned toward and become someone she simply included when it was convenient. I moved on to the next frame, a family holiday from years ago, all of us standing close together, arms around each other. And I remembered how much effort I had put into those moments, planning, organizing, making sure everything felt right, making sure everyone felt taken care of. And I began to see those memories differently, not as evidence of closeness, but as moments where I had been holding everything together, quietly, consistently, without expecting anything in return. And perhaps that had been the problem, perhaps by not expecting anything, I had made it easy for them to give nothing. I returned to the kitchen and opened the folder from the lottery office, flipping through the pages slowly, reading each line, each instruction, each option, and I paused on the section about financial advisors, about setting up structures to manage large sums responsibly, about protecting assets and planning for the future, and I thought about how carefully this system was designed, how it anticipated risk, how it accounted for human behavior. And it occurred to me that while the money was new, the dynamics around it would not be. People would react in ways that were entirely predictable, shaped by what they believed they were entitled to. And I felt a quiet clarity settle over me. I did not need to guess how Sophie would respond if she knew. I already had my answer. I closed the folder and set it aside. And then I did something small but deliberate. I walked over to the cabinet where I keep my checkbook, something I rarely used anymore, and I opened it, flipping past the blank pages until I reached the last few entries, modest amounts, utilities, groceries, things that kept life moving but did not draw attention. And I thought about the contrast, about the difference between what had been and what now was. And I realized that the most important part of this change was not the scale. It was the choice, the ability to decide where things went, who benefited, and under what conditions. And for the first time, that decision felt entirely mine. Later that afternoon, I put on my coat and drove to the grocery store, not because I needed anything in particular, but because I wanted to move through a normal space, to see how it felt to carry this knowledge quietly among people who had no idea. I walked the aisle slowly, picking up a few items, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a small bag of apples, and I noticed how ordinary everything seemed, how unchanged the world was despite what had shifted in my own life. And there was something comforting in that. Something steady. I checked out, paid in cash, and when the cashier handed me my receipt, I folded it neatly and placed it in my purse, right next to the ticket, the contrast between the two pieces of paper almost amusing in its simplicity, one representing a routine purchase, the other something far beyond routine, and yet they sat side by side, indistinguishable to anyone else. When I returned home, I placed the groceries on the counter and began putting them away, each movement measured, unhurried. And as I closed the refrigerator door, my phone buzzed again, this time a message from Sophie, a picture of the cruise ship, large and gleaming against a blue sky, with a caption about how excited she was, how she could not wait. And I looked at the image for a moment before setting the phone down without responding, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of understanding. She was sharing what mattered to her, what she believed was significant, and I no longer felt the need to insert myself into that narrative. I had my own now, one that did not require her acknowledgement to be real. I walked back to the table and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the surface, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not because of what I had gained, but because of what I had finally seen clearly. And in that clarity, I found something I had not expected, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a calm, steady sense of direction, as if the path ahead, once uncertain and shaped by other people's choices, had finally become something I could walk on my own terms, without explanation, without permission, and without needing anyone else to understand it before I took the next step. I did not respond to the message about the cruise, not that day, not the next, and by the third morning I noticed something interesting. Sophie did not follow up. She did not ask if I had seen it, did not wonder why I had not replied, and that told me more than any conversation could have. It told me that her sharing had never really been about connection. It had been about expression, about putting something out into the world and assuming it would be received, acknowledged, appreciated, without requiring anything deeper in return. And I realized that for years I had been the one filling in that missing piece, responding, encouraging, reinforcing, making sure she felt seen. And now that I had stepped back, even slightly, there was a quiet gap where that reinforcement used to be, and she had not yet noticed it. I spent that morning going through old drawers, not looking for anything specific, just letting my hands move through objects that had accumulated over time, letters, receipts, photographs, small things that had once felt important enough to keep. And as I sorted through them, I began to see a pattern not just in the items themselves, but in what they represented: years of giving, of supporting, of showing up in ways that were expected but rarely acknowledged. And I did not feel bitterness about it. Not exactly. It was more like recognition, like finally reading a sentence you have seen many times before but never fully understood. And once you understand it, you cannot go back to seeing it the same way. I set aside a small stack of photographs, ones I wanted to keep close, and placed the rest back into the drawer, not because they no longer mattered, but because they no longer defined me in the way they once had. Later that afternoon, I made another phone call, this time to the number listed in the folder under Financial Advisory Services, and when the woman answered, her voice calm and measured, I introduced myself and explained, in general terms, that I had recently come into a significant amount of money and wanted to understand how to manage it responsibly. I did not mention the exact figure. I did not need to. The way she responded told me she understood the situation regardless. She scheduled an appointment for the following week and suggested I bring any relevant documents. And when I hung up, I felt that same sense of quiet control settle over me again. Each step deliberate, each decision made without urgency, without pressure, just a steady movement forward. That evening, as the light outside began to fade, my phone rang again. And this time it was Daniel. His name appearing on the screen felt different, unexpected, and I answered after a moment, keeping my voice even. "Hello," I said, and he greeted me warmly, more warmly than usual, asking how I was, how I had been since Thanksgiving, and I listened carefully, not just to his words but to the space between them, to the way he paused, the way he chose his phrases, and I could sense something there, not quite concern, not quite curiosity, but something close to it. He mentioned that Sophie had been busy planning the trip, that they had been talking about logistics, packing, schedules, and then, almost casually, he brought up the ticket. "Did you ever check that lottery ticket?" he asked, his tone light, almost joking, and I could hear the faintest hint of interest beneath it. And I said, "Not yet." The same answer I had given Sophie, the same calm, unremarkable words, and there was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to register, before he laughed softly and said something about how those things rarely amount to anything, how it was just a bit of fun. And I agreed again, because agreeing cost me nothing, and it gave me everything I needed: space, time, clarity. As the conversation moved on, he asked if I needed anything, if there was anything they could help with, and the offer sounded kind on the surface, but it was vague, open-ended in a way that required me to define the need, to initiate the request. And I realized that this too was familiar, help that existed in theory but rarely in practice. And I thanked him, said that I was fine, that everything was under control. And when we ended the call, I set the phone down and let out a slow breath, not from tension, but from understanding. They were beginning to circle, not because they knew anything, but because something in the pattern had shifted, something subtle but noticeable, my lack of response, my absence from their usual flow of communication. And it had created a small ripple, just enough to draw their attention without revealing the cause. And I knew that ripple would grow, slowly, naturally. As long as I did not interfere with it, I walked over to the window and looked out at the street, the same quiet scene as always. And I thought about how many times I had stood there before, feeling uncertain, waiting for something to change, and now that it had, now that I had the ability to shape what came next, I felt no need to rush, no need to announce, no need to explain, because for the first time, the pace of everything belonged to me. And as I turned away from the window, as I moved through the house with that same steady rhythm, I understood that what I was building was not just a plan, it was a boundary, one that had never fully existed before, and one that, once established, would not be easily crossed again. The next few days unfolded slowly, almost deliberately, as if time itself had decided to give me space to think, to observe, to understand what had always been there, but never fully acknowledged. And I found myself paying closer attention to everything, not just what was said, but what was not said, not just what was offered, but what was withheld. And it was in those quiet details that the truth became impossible to ignore. Sophie began texting more frequently, small messages at first, casual updates about the cruise preparations, pictures of outfits she had bought, comments about how excited she was, and each message carried the same tone, light, confident, certain that I would respond the way I always had, with enthusiasm, with support, with reassurance, and for the first time, I did not rush to provide that. I let the messages sit, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day, and when I did respond, it was simple, polite, measured, enough to acknowledge without reinforcing, enough to maintain connection without giving away control, and I could feel the difference immediately, not in anything she said directly, but in the way her messages began to shift, becoming slightly more frequent, slightly more detailed, as if she was trying to fill the space that my restraint had created. And I watched this unfold with a kind of calm curiosity, not judgment, not resentment, just observation, as if I were finally seeing a pattern that had always been there, but had never been clear enough to study. One afternoon, as I was sorting through the mail, I came across a flyer for a community financial seminar, something I would have ignored before, but now I paused, reading the details, considering how differently I approached information now, how every piece of knowledge felt like something to be evaluated, something to be understood in context, and I set it aside. Not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of how much I had relied on instinct in the past, on trust, on the assumption that the people closest to me would act in ways that aligned with care, and now I was learning to rely on something else, something quieter but far more dependable, clarity. Later that evening, Sophie called again, and this time her voice carried a subtle shift, still warm, still familiar, but edged with something I had not heard before, a slight uncertainty, as if she was testing the space between us, trying to understand why it felt different. She asked about my day, about what I had been doing, and I answered honestly but briefly, leaving out the parts that no longer belonged to her, the appointment, the plans, the quiet decisions that were beginning to take shape. And then she paused, just for a second, before asking if I needed anything, if there was something she could bring me, something she could help with before the trip, and the question sounded thoughtful on the surface, but I could hear the underlying question beneath it, a search for reassurance, for confirmation that the dynamic had not changed, and I said, "No, I am fine." The same calm, steady words, and this time the silence that followed lasted a little longer, not uncomfortable, but noticeable, and when she spoke again, her tone was lighter, almost dismissive, as if she had decided that whatever she sensed was not important enough to explore, and the conversation moved on, back to her plans, her excitement, her expectations, and I listened, not as someone waiting to be included, but as someone who had stepped just slightly outside the frame, and from that position, everything looked different, clearer, more defined. After the call ended, I sat at the table and looked at the folder again, at the documents that represented a future I had not planned but was now responsible for shaping. And I thought about the concept of value, how it had been assigned to me so casually, so confidently, based on assumptions that no longer held. And I realized that what I was doing now was not just about protecting money. It was about redefining that value on my terms, without explanation, without negotiation. The next morning, I drove to the bank, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to take another step, however small, in a direction that felt intentional. I spoke with a representative about opening a new account, one that would be separate, private, structured in a way that aligned with the plans I was beginning to form. And as we went through the process, answering questions, signing forms, I felt that same steady sense of control deepen each decision. Building on the last, each action reinforcing the boundary I was creating, and when I left the bank, the air outside felt crisp, clear, as if the world itself had sharpened slightly. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting to anything. I was not adjusting, not compensating, not making space for someone else's expectations. I was choosing, deliberately, quietly. And as I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I understood that this was only the beginning, that the real test would come later, when the truth surfaced, when the dynamic shifted in ways that could not be ignored. And I felt no fear about that, only a calm readiness, because I knew something they did not. I knew exactly who they had been when they thought I had nothing, and that knowledge, more than anything else, would guide what I chose to do next. The pattern continued, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in air pressure before a storm, and I found myself noticing things I would have overlooked before, small inconsistencies, slight changes in tone. The way Sophie's messages began to carry a different kind of energy, less casual, more probing, as if she were trying to locate something she could not quite see. And I understood why. Because when a dynamic changes, even slightly, it creates a kind of imbalance, and people feel that before they understand it. They react to it without knowing why. And I had become very careful not to correct that imbalance for them, not to smooth it over the way I always had. Instead, I let it exist. I let it grow, because in that space, truth had a way of revealing itself without being forced. One morning, as I was reviewing documents at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed with a notification, a social media post from Sophie, a picture of her and Daniel at a travel agency, smiling broadly, brochures spread out in front of them, the caption filled with excitement, counting down the days, talking about how they had earned this. And I read those words more than once, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed something I had already begun to understand: the way she framed her world, the way she defined value, effort, reward. It was all contained within her own perspective, her own narrative, and there was no space in it for anything that did not directly serve that view. I set the phone down and returned to my papers, but the thought stayed with me, not as a source of pain, but as a point of clarity. Later that afternoon, I attended the appointment with the financial advisor, a quiet office with soft lighting and neutral tones, designed to feel reassuring without drawing attention to itself. The man I met with was thorough, attentive, asking questions that required me to think not just about numbers, but about intentions, about what I wanted my future to look like, about who I wanted to include in it. And for the first time, I answered those questions without automatically placing Sophie at the center of every decision. I spoke about independence, about stability, about creating something that reflected my values rather than my obligations. And as the conversation continued, I could feel a structure forming, not just financially, but mentally, a framework that allowed me to see my life as something separate, something complete on its own. And when we discussed beneficiaries, the word itself seemed to carry more weight than it ever had before, because it was no longer a given, no longer an automatic extension of family ties. It was a choice, one that required consideration, intention, and honesty. I did not make any final decisions that day, but I left with a clearer understanding of what those decisions would need to reflect. And as I drove home, I felt a quiet sense of alignment, as if the external steps I was taking were beginning to match the internal shift that had already taken place. That evening, Sophie called again, and this time her voice was different, more direct, less casual. She asked if everything was all right, if something was wrong, and the question was framed lightly, almost jokingly, but I could hear the edge beneath it, the uncertainty that had been building over the past few days, and I realized that the ripple had grown just enough to be noticed. I answered calmly, told her that everything was fine, that I had just been busy, and there was a pause, longer this time, as if she were deciding whether to push further, and then she mentioned the ticket again, more directly now, asking if I had checked it, if I had gone to the store, if I had done anything with it, and I said, "Not yet." The same words, the same tone, but this time they landed differently. I could hear it in the silence that followed, the way it stretched just a little too long. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a hint of disbelief, as if the idea that I had not acted, had not followed the expected pattern, did not quite make sense to her. She laughed softly, said something about how I should at least see if it was worth anything, and I agreed again, because agreement had become a tool, a way to maintain the surface while everything beneath it shifted. And as the conversation moved on, I listened with a kind of detachment that would have surprised me just a week earlier, not because I cared less, but because I understood more. I understood that the version of me she expected, the one who responded immediately, who shared everything, who sought her input, that version no longer existed in the same way, and I did not feel the need to explain that, to justify it, or to make it comfortable for her. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the house and let the silence settle around me, and I realized that this moment, was a turning point, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something subtle had shifted irreversibly. The balance had changed, the roles had adjusted, and I was no longer reacting to her expectations. I was observing them, measuring them, deciding how and when to respond. And as I looked at the ticket, still tucked safely in my purse, I understood that the real value it held was not just in what it could provide, but in what it had already revealed, a truth that had been present all along, waiting for the right moment to become undeniable. And now that it had, there was no going back, only forward, with clarity, with intention, and with a quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms. By the end of that week, the rhythm had changed completely, not on the surface, not in any way that would be obvious to someone looking in from the outside, but underneath, in the space where expectations used to live, something had shifted permanently, and I could feel it in every interaction, every message, every pause that lingered just a second too long. Sophie was no longer just sharing, she was watching, listening in a different way, trying to understand what had changed without asking directly, and I let her wonder, because sometimes uncertainty reveals more than any answer ever could. That Saturday afternoon, she stopped by unannounced, something she had not done in months, and when I opened the door, I saw it immediately. The careful smile, the quick scan of the room behind me, the subtle way her eyes moved, taking in details she would have ignored before. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, as if that explained everything, and I stepped aside, letting her in without question, because I did not need to challenge the reason. I was more interested in what she would do next. She walked through the living room slowly, commenting on small things, the arrangement of the furniture, the plants by the window, the same things she had seen countless times before, but was now noticing as if they held new meaning, and I followed at a distance, watching, not interfering, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had begun to shift, and she looked at me for a moment before speaking, really looked, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. "You seem different," she said finally, her tone light, but her eyes focused, and I held her gaze calmly, not denying it, not confirming it, just letting the statement exist between us. And after a second, she laughed softly, brushing it off as if it had been a passing thought, but the question remained, unspoken, unresolved. She asked again about the ticket, this time more directly. "Did you ever check it?" she said, and I could hear the shift in her voice. No longer casual, no longer dismissive, but edged with something else, curiosity, maybe even a hint of concern, and I answered the same way I always had. "Not yet." The words steady, unremarkable, and she frowned slightly, just for a moment, before smoothing it over with a smile. "You really should," she said. "You never know." And I nodded, because she was right. You never know. And that was the part she had not considered when she handed it to me across that table. The part no one ever considers when they assign value too quickly. We talked for a while after that, about ordinary things, the weather, her plans, the cruise, always the cruise, and I listened the way I always had, but from a different place now, not as someone waiting to be included, but as someone observing a pattern play out, and every now and then, she would glance at me, as if expecting something more, a reaction, a comment, something to restore the balance she was used to, and when it did not come, I could see the uncertainty flicker again, small but persistent, like a light that would not quite settle. After an hour or so, she stood up, saying she had to get going, that she had errands to run, and I walked her to the door. The same quiet routine, the same polite exchange, but as she stepped outside, she paused, turning back to look at me, and for a second, the mask slipped just enough to reveal something real beneath it, not hostility, not even frustration, but confusion, the kind that comes when something familiar no longer behaves the way you expect it to, and she smiled again, quickly, covering it. "Call me if you need anything," she said, and I nodded, because that was the script, the line we both knew, even if it no longer held the same meaning. And when she drove away, I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet settle back into place, and I realized that this visit had confirmed everything I needed to know, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not understand. She was trying to locate a change without recognizing that the change was not in circumstances, it was in perspective, and that was something she could not see from where she stood. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the table, and I allowed myself a moment to consider what came next, because the pieces were all there now. The pattern was clear, the responses were predictable, and the only question left was how I would choose to move forward, not in reaction, not in response, but with intention, with clarity, and with the quiet certainty that whatever I decided, it would be based not on what they expected from me, but on what I had finally come to understand about them. And as I reached for my purse, feeling the folded ticket still safely inside, I knew that the time for observation was beginning to give way to something else, something more deliberate, more defined, a shift from watching to acting, not impulsively, not dramatically, but carefully, in a way that would leave no room for misunderstanding. And for the first time since that night at the Thanksgiving table, I felt not just prepared, but ready. The next step did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly, almost naturally, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to take shape. And I could feel that moment approaching with a kind of calm certainty, not rushed, not forced, just inevitable. And it began with something simple, something small enough that it would not raise suspicion. I decided to create a situation, not a lie, not anything dramatic, just a test, a way to see how things would move when a different kind of need was introduced. So the following morning, I called Sophie, my voice steady, unhurried, and when she answered, I told her that I had been thinking about some repairs around the house, that the heater had been acting up, that there might be some costs involved that I was not fully prepared for. And I let the words sit there, not asking directly for help, just placing the information gently into the conversation. And there was a pause, a longer one than usual, before she responded, her tone shifting quickly into something sympathetic, but controlled. "Oh no, that sounds expensive," she said, and I could hear her thinking, calculating, measuring the situation against her own priorities. And then she added, "Have you looked into getting a quote?" And I said that I had not yet, that I was still figuring things out. And again there was that pause, that space where a different kind of response might have lived, an offer, a suggestion, something more concrete. But it did not come. Instead, she moved the conversation forward, gently redirecting it, talking about how important it was to plan for these things, how sometimes it is better to wait, to see if it is really necessary. And I listened, not interrupting, not challenging, just letting her words fill the space. Because this was the answer, not in what she said, but in what she chose not to say. And when the conversation ended, I set the phone down and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. And I felt no disappointment, no surprise, just confirmation, clear and unmistakable, that the pattern I had been observing was not imagined. It was real, it was consistent, and it would not change unless something forced it to. Later that afternoon, Daniel called, and this time his tone was more direct, less casual. He mentioned that Sophie had told him about the heater, that he wanted to check in, to see what was going on, and I could hear the difference immediately, not concern exactly, but awareness, as if the information had triggered something that required attention. And I explained the situation the same way I had to Sophie, simple, factual, without emphasis, and he listened, asking a few questions, practical ones, about costs, about timing, about whether I had considered different options. And then he paused, and for a moment I thought he might offer something more, something concrete. But instead he said, "Well, let us know what you find out." And the words were polite, reasonable, but they carried the same absence as Sophie's response, the same careful distance, and I thanked him, because that was the role I had always played, even as I stepped further away from it. And after we hung up, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I had just seen, not in fragments, not in isolated moments, but as a complete picture, a pattern of behavior that had been consistent, predictable, and entirely independent of anything I had done or not done. And that realization brought with it a kind of clarity that was almost physical, like a weight shifting, settling into place. Because once you see something that clearly, you cannot unsee it. You cannot pretend it is something else. You cannot continue to respond as if it might change on its own. And that is when I knew, not just in theory, but in practice, that the next phase had begun, not observation, not quiet adjustment, but decision, deliberate, thoughtful, and entirely my own. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same street, the same houses, the same steady world that had not changed, and I realized that everything I needed to know was already in front of me, not in dramatic gestures, not in obvious betrayals, but in the absence of something that should have been there all along. And as I turned away from the glass, moving back into the quiet of my home, I reached for my purse, feeling the weight of the ticket inside, not as something fragile anymore, but as something solid, something real, and I understood that what came next would not be about proving anything to them. It would not be about confrontation or explanation. It would be about alignment, about making choices that reflected what I had finally come to understand. And as I sat down at the table once more, the same place where everything had begun to shift, I allowed myself a small, steady breath. Because for the first time, I was not waiting for them to show me who they were. I already knew, and now it was time to decide exactly what that knowledge meant for me. The decision did not feel dramatic when it arrived. It did not come with urgency or emotion. It came quietly, like something settling into place after a long period of uncertainty. And once it was there, I knew it would not move. I spent the next morning reviewing everything again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to see it clearly, without distraction, without the influence of habit or expectation. And as I read through the documents, the options, the structures that could be put in place, I began to outline what I wanted, not in vague terms, not in general ideas, but in specific, deliberate choices. I wanted independence, not just financially, but in every sense of the word. I wanted stability that did not rely on anyone else's behavior, anyone else's decisions, and I wanted to ensure that whatever I built moving forward reflected what I had learned, not what I had once assumed. I called the advisor again, scheduled a follow-up meeting, and this time I went in with clarity, with intention, with a sense of direction that had been missing before. We discussed trusts, long-term planning, ways to allocate resources in a manner that protected both the present and the future. And when the conversation turned again to beneficiaries, I did not hesitate the way I might have in the past. I spoke carefully, thoughtfully, outlining conditions, structures, considerations that ensured any decision I made would be based on more than proximity or expectation. And as I spoke, I could feel the difference, not just in the choices themselves, but in the way I approached them. There was no guilt, no sense of obligation guiding my words, only clarity, only alignment with what I knew to be true. When the meeting ended, I left with more than just paperwork. I left with a framework, something solid that would shape what came next. And as I drove home, I thought about Sophie, about Daniel, about the conversations we had just days earlier, and I realized that the gap between what they believed and what was real had grown wider, not because I had changed anything on the surface, but because I had stopped filling it for them. I had stopped making assumptions that benefited them, stopped reinforcing a dynamic that no longer made sense, and that gap would not remain unnoticed forever. It would eventually demand attention, demand explanation, and when it did, I would be ready. That evening, I took another step, one that felt small but carried weight. I opened a new account under the structure we had discussed, separate, secure, designed with intention, and as I completed the process, signing my name with steady hands, I understood that this was more than a financial action. It was a declaration, quiet, private, but definitive, that my life moving forward would be shaped by my decisions, not by habit, not by expectation, not by the silent agreements I had once accepted without question. When I returned home, I placed the documents in a drawer, not hidden, not concealed, just kept in a space that belonged to me. And I sat at the table for a while, letting the quiet settle, letting the weight of what I had done integrate into something steady, something real. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophie, a picture this time of a suitcase, neatly packed, ready for the trip. The caption filled with excitement, with anticipation, and I looked at it for a moment before setting the phone down, because I understood now that her world, her focus, her sense of importance, it was all contained within that image, within that experience. And there was nothing wrong with that, not inherently, but it existed separately from mine, and I no longer felt the need to merge the two, to align them in a way that diminished one to support the other. The following day, she called again, her tone lighter, almost cheerful, talking about departure times, airport schedules, small details that filled her thoughts, and I listened, responding when appropriate, maintaining the same calm, measured presence I had adopted. And then, almost as an afterthought, she asked again about the ticket. "You still have not checked it," she said, and this time there was something different in her voice, not just curiosity, but a faint edge of impatience, as if my lack of action was beginning to disrupt the narrative she had constructed. And I said, "I will get to it." Simple, unremarkable, but enough to keep the surface intact. And there was a pause, brief but noticeable, before she moved on, letting it go for now, but I could sense that it would not remain unaddressed forever. And as the conversation ended, as I set the phone down once more, I realized that everything was aligning, not by accident, not by chance, but through a series of deliberate choices, each one building on the last, each one reinforcing the direction I had chosen. And I felt no urgency to reveal anything, no need to accelerate what was already unfolding naturally, because the strength of what I was building did not come from speed. It came from clarity, from patience, from the understanding that when the truth finally surfaced, it would not need explanation. It would stand on its own, supported by everything that had come before it. And as I sat there in the quiet of my home, the same familiar space that now felt entirely different, I understood that I was no longer preparing for what might happen. I was shaping what would happen, and that distinction, more than anything else, was where the real change had taken place. The day they left for the cruise, everything felt unusually quiet, not just in the house, but in the rhythm of communication itself. No messages, no updates, no casual check-ins, just a sudden absence that made the space around it more noticeable. And I realized how accustomed I had been to that constant stream, how much of my attention had once been shaped by it, and now, without it, there was a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. I moved through my morning slowly, deliberately, making coffee, opening the windows to let in the cool air, and for a moment I stood there, looking out at the street, thinking about how different this same view had felt just weeks ago, when I was still waiting, still adjusting, still responding to something that was never fully mine. And now, that waiting had ended, not because something external had changed, but because I had stopped placing myself in that position. I sat down at the table and reached for the ticket, holding it between my fingers, feeling the weight of it not as a possibility anymore, but as a certainty that had already been confirmed. And I knew that the time for silence was coming to an end, not because I owed anyone an explanation, but because the moment itself had arrived, the point where truth would naturally surface, whether I introduced it or not. I picked up my phone and dialed Sophie's number, knowing she would not answer, knowing she was already on the ship, already immersed in her own experience. And I let it ring once before hanging up, not as an attempt to reach her, but as a marker, a quiet acknowledgement that this was the moment everything would begin to shift. Later that afternoon, I drove to the lottery office again, this time not for confirmation, but for completion, the final steps, the signatures, the formal recognition of what had already become real. And as I sat across from the same man in the gray suit, listening as he reviewed the details once more, I felt no surge of emotion, no overwhelming sense of excitement, just a steady awareness that this was the point where everything moved from private to official, from something I knew to something that existed in the world beyond me. And when I signed the final document, my name written clearly, deliberately, I understood that the quiet phase was over, that from this moment forward, things would begin to unfold in ways that could not be contained, that information would move, that questions would arise, that the space I had been observing would begin to fill. And as I left the building, stepping back into the open air, I felt a calm readiness settle over me. Not anticipation, not anxiety, just readiness. Because everything that needed to be understood had already been understood, everything that needed to be decided had already been decided. The rest was simply the natural progression of events. The following morning, the first call came, not from Sophie, but from Daniel, his voice sharp, alert, carrying a tension that had not been there before. He asked if I had seen the news, if I had heard about the winning ticket in our area, and I could hear the connection forming in his mind, the pieces, aligning in a way that had not been possible before, and I answered calmly, yes, I heard, letting the words settle, letting the silence stretch just enough for the implication to take shape. And when he asked the question directly, when he said, was it you? I did not hesitate. I did not soften it. I did not redirect. I said, yes, simple, clear, undeniable. And the silence that followed was different from any we had shared before, not uncertain, not searching, but full, heavy with the realization of what that answer meant. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed completely, no longer casual, no longer distant, but immediate, engaged, as if a switch had been flipped, and he began asking questions, quick, overlapping, about how, when, what I planned to do, and I listened without interrupting, allowing the urgency to reveal itself fully, because this was the moment, the one I had prepared for, not in terms of what I would say, but in terms of how I would understand it. And when he paused, finally, waiting for a response, I spoke calmly, deliberately, choosing each word with care, not to control the situation, but to reflect the clarity I had reached. I have already taken care of everything, I said, and there was a slight hesitation on his end, as if the answer had not matched the expectation, and I continued, not explaining, not justifying, just stating what was true. I have made my decisions, and the weight of those words settled between us, not dramatic, not confrontational, but final, and I could hear it in the way his breathing shifted, in the way his next question slowed, became more cautious, more measured, because the dynamic had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And when the call ended, I set the phone down and sat in the quiet of the room, the same quiet that had been there all along, but now carrying a different meaning, not absence, not waiting, but completion. And I understood, without any doubt, that everything I had seen, everything I had learned, had led to this exact moment, not as an ending, but as a point of truth, clear, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. The silence after that call did not last long. It never does when something shifts that completely, and by the next morning my phone was ringing again, this time with a kind of urgency that had not existed before. Sophie's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring. Once, twice, before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, and when I said hello, her voice came through quickly, too quickly, layered with something I had not heard in a long time. Not warmth, not ease, but intensity. She asked if it was true, if what Daniel had said was real, and I answered the same way I had before, calmly, clearly, yes. And there was a pause, a long one, as if the word had landed somewhere she was not prepared to receive it. And when she spoke again, everything had changed. Her tone softened, shifted into something careful, something measured. She asked how I was, if I had been overwhelmed, if I needed help, and I listened to the words, to the way they were arranged, to the way concern appeared suddenly, fully formed, as if it had always been there, waiting, and I did not interrupt. I let her continue, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, not the revelation itself, but the response to it, the way everything realigns when value is suddenly reassessed. She spoke about visiting, about coming by when she returned, about spending time together, making plans, her words moving quickly now, building something that had not existed before, and I sat quietly, allowing it all to unfold, because there was no need to stop it, no need to correct it. The truth was already doing that on its own, and when she finally paused, waiting for me to respond, I spoke slowly, deliberately, not to create distance, but to reflect the clarity I had reached. "I appreciate that," I said, and there was another pause, shorter this time, as if she were adjusting to the pace, to the tone, to the fact that the conversation was not moving in the direction she expected, and I continued, not with explanation, not with accusation, but with something simpler, something more final. "I have already made my arrangements," and the words settled between us, quiet but firm, and I could feel the shift on the other end of the line, the moment where understanding began to take shape, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the direction of her thoughts. She asked what I meant, her voice careful again, searching, and I answered in the same steady tone. "I have structured everything in a way that reflects what I need moving forward." And I did not elaborate, because the details were not the point. The point was the boundary, the decision, the fact that it had been made without consultation, without expectation, without the automatic inclusion that had once defined every choice I made. And there was a silence then, longer, heavier, not empty, but filled with the realization of what that meant. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, less certain. She said my name, softly, as if trying to reconnect to something familiar, something that no longer existed in the same way. And I felt a brief moment of recognition, not regret, not hesitation, just acknowledgement of what had been. And then it passed, because what mattered now was not the past, not the version of us that had once existed, but the clarity of what stood in front of me. "I will always care about you," I said, and the words were true, steady, unchanged, but "I will not build my life around what you assume I will give." And the statement was not harsh, not confrontational. It was simply accurate, and that made it stronger than anything else I could have said. There was no immediate response, just the sound of her breathing on the other end of the line, and I knew that this was the moment where everything settled, where the understanding moved from possibility to certainty, not because I had forced it, but because it had been revealed naturally, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to question. And when the call ended, it did so quietly, without resolution, without agreement, but with something more important, clarity. And I set the phone down and sat there for a moment, letting the stillness return, not as something empty, but as something complete. The house felt the same as it always had, the same walls, the same light coming through the windows, but the space within it felt entirely different, not defined by absence, not shaped by expectation, but grounded in something steady, something that belonged fully to me. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street, the same view I had seen so many times before, and I realized that nothing outside had changed. The world moved the same way it always had, but my place in it had shifted completely, not because of what I had gained, but because of what I had finally understood. And as I turned away from the glass, moving back into the quiet of the room, I felt no need to revisit what had happened, no need to explain it again, because the truth did not require repetition. It stood on its own, clear and undeniable. And in that clarity, I found something I had not been looking for, but recognized immediately when it arrived. Peace, not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and choosing, finally, to remain there.